This happened a few years ago, but it still haunts me. I lived in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone. My family owned an old farmhouse on the outskirts, surrounded by dense woods. It had been in my family for generations, and although it creaked and groaned in the wind, I never felt unsafe. That was until one particular night in the dead of winter. I had just gotten home from work. It was a little past 11 p.m. and the roads were slick with ice. My parents were out of town, so it was just me and our family dog, Rusty. He was an old German shepherd, the kind of dog who never barked unless something was really wrong. That night, I was exhausted. I made a quick dinner, let Rusty out for a few minutes, and then settled into bed. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wood expanding in the cold. I was drifting off when I heard something strange. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my bedroom window. My heart nearly stopped. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor. I lay there, frozen, listening. Maybe it was ice shifting on the roof? A bird? But then it came again. 3 slow knocks. Deliberate, purposeful. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. Rusty, who had been curled up on the floor, was now standing at the bedroom door, ears perked, staring at the window. I forced myself to turn and look. The window was pitch black, nothing but my reflection staring back at me. But then, my breath caught. In the reflection just behind me in the darkened room was a shape, a tall, gaunt figure, barely visible in the dim light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My skin went cold. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the glass? Rusty let out a low, guttural growl, not at the window, but at my closet door. I had left the closet slightly open when I changed earlier, and now, in the sliver of darkness between the door and the frame, I saw it. An eye. A single bloodshot eye staring directly at me. I scrambled out of bed and ran for the hallway, Rusty lunging at the door as I bolted downstairs. I grabbed the shotgun my dad kept in the hall closet and turned, heart pounding, aiming at the stairwell. Silence. Nothing moved. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, gripping the shotgun so tight my hands ached. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps began descending from the 2nd floor. One step, then another, then silence. Rusty was snarling, but he wouldn't go up the stairs. I didn't blame him. I felt paralyzed, every instinct telling me that whatever was in my house was not human. And then, nothing. The footsteps stopped. The house went dead silent. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, listening. Eventually, I mustered the courage to check the rooms. My bedroom closet was empty. The window was locked. But the footprints in the snow outside my house told a different story. There were 2 sets, one leading up to my bedroom window, and another set leading away from the front door, the door I had locked before bed. The police arrived shortly after. They searched the woods, but they never found anyone. They told me it was probably just a drifter, some trespasser looking for a place to sleep. But if that was the case, why did they knock on my 2nd floor window? And why were they inside my house? I never stayed in that house alone again. Last autumn, I set out to hike a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. I'd done solo hikes before, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the season, the isolation, or just my own growing unease. Still, I brushed off the nerves. This was supposed to be an adventure. The first few days went smoothly. The trail was breathtaking. Rolling fog over dense forests, the scent of damp earth, the distant call of an owl at night. I kept my routine simple. Hike from dawn until dusk, set up camp off the main trail to avoid unwanted attention, and keep moving. But by the 3rd night, something changed. I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first, but my gut told me something was off. I sat up in my tent, listening. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. No wind, no insects, just a heavy silence pressing down around me. Then I heard it. Crunch. A single footstep. I held my breath. Maybe an animal? A deer? But then another step. And another. It wasn't random movement. Someone or something was walking near my camp. Heart pounding, I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a crack. I shone the light outside, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. But then I saw it. Up on the ridge, silhouetted against the moonlight, was a figure. Tall, motionless, just watching. A wave of cold fear washed over me. I shut the light off immediately, hoping whoever, or whatever it was, hadn't seen me. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. By morning, the figure was gone. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump that looked human. But deep down, I knew better. Things escalated after that. Small items from my pack began to disappear. My extra flashlight, a protein bar, my pocket knife. Just like before, I second-guessed myself. Maybe I'd misplaced them. Maybe I was just exhausted. But the real proof came 2 nights later. That evening, I made camp earlier than usual. I was mentally drained and I just wanted to rest. As a precaution, I tied the zippers of my tent shut from the inside, something I'd never felt the need to do before. At some point in the night, I woke up again. Not from a noise this time, but from a feeling. I wasn't alone. Something was just outside my tent. The thin fabric barely separated me from whatever was out there. My pulse hammered as I listened, ears straining for any sound. Then, ever so slowly, the zipper on my tent started to move. Someone was trying to open it. Instinct took over. I grabbed my survival knife and slashed wildly at the entrance, letting out a guttural yell. There was a sudden scuffle, footsteps retreating, leaves crunching, and then silence. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, scanning the woods. Nothing. But then I noticed something near the edge of my campsite. Footprints. Bare footprints. They led back up the ridge, disappearing into the dark. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I packed up and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest road. I flagged down the first car I saw and got out of there. I never reported it. What would I even say? But one thing is certain. I'll never hike alone again. Because something or someone is still out there. And I don't think they were just watching. The Forgotten Camp. It was early autumn when I decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail that had always intrigued me. The stretch was known for its remote beauty, quiet ridgelines and deep forests where you could get lost in your thoughts without hearing the hum of civilization. I'd done solo trips before, nothing too extreme, but this one was different. I had recently been feeling the weight of life's distractions, and I was looking for a way to clear my head. I planned to cover about 70 miles, spending 7 days on the trail. The first few days were perfect. The weather was crisp but not too cold, and the fall colors were vibrant. I hiked during the day, set up camp at night, and was always careful to stay off the main trail, to keep a low profile. Solo hikers always attract attention, especially in such remote areas, so I made sure no one could see my camp from the main path. I kept my routine simple: find a secluded spot, set up my tent, cook my meal, and watch the stars as I fell asleep. On the 4th night, something changed. I had been making good time, and I was just about a day's hike away from the section where I planned to stop. The sun was setting behind the mountain ridges, casting long shadows over the trail. I had decided to make camp early that night and enjoy the peace of the forest. I found a small clearing, nestled between 2 large oak trees, and set up my tent. There was a small creek nearby that made the perfect background sound as I unpacked my gear. Everything felt right. I cooked a simple meal, ate it while watching the orange sky fade into twilight, and then curled up in my sleeping bag. But then, in the stillness of the night, I heard it. Footsteps. I was no stranger to the noises of the forest, raccoons, deer, squirrels. But this was different. The sound was deliberate, slow, and heavy. It wasn't the random scurrying of small animals. It was a person. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps didn't come any closer, but they were unmistakable. They were coming from somewhere in the woods, maybe 100 yards away, near the trail. I had set my camp up far off the path, and I didn't think anyone should be out here. The trail wasn't that busy this time of year, and I hadn't passed anyone for hours. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle from the side of my tent. I wasn't an expert with firearms, but I always carried one on these hikes, especially when I was alone. I unzipped the tent carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible, and peered into the dark. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing. But that feeling, something was off. It crawled up my spine like a spider. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. After a few minutes, I decided to call it a night. I zipped the tent back up and settled down, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing small noises from outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. I wasn't sure if it was just my nerves, but it didn't feel right. It felt like someone was out there, just waiting. The next morning, I packed up my camp and started walking earlier than usual. I told myself it was nothing, just the sounds of the forest playing tricks on me. But as the day wore on, I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midday, I found an old campsite off the trail. There was a small fire ring, some broken gear scattered around, and the remnants of an old tarp. It looked abandoned, maybe years old, but something about it made my stomach drop. I checked the surroundings, scanning for any signs of life, but found nothing. I decided to leave, not wanting to linger too long in a place that felt off. That night, I camped on the edge of a ridge with a great view of the valley below. I had a clear line of sight all around, which made me feel safer. But as I started to settle in, something caught my eye. Down in the valley, near the base of the mountain, there was a light flickering. It looked like a campfire. I wondered who else could be out here. The trail wasn't a popular spot this time of year, and the light was far too distant to be any hiker. But I couldn't stop staring at it. It was almost like it was calling me. After a while, I shook my head, telling myself it was just another trick of the wilderness, maybe the reflection of the sunset, or some other natural phenomenon. I turned my attention back to my camp, but it still felt unsettling. I eventually fell asleep, but not without the strange feeling lingering in the back of my mind. I kept waking up, hearing things outside my tent. At one point, I thought I heard someone breathing right outside. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my rifle close, hoping that I was just imagining things. The following day, I pushed forward, my pace quickening. I wasn't even sure why I felt so urgent to get away from the area. It wasn't until I reached a ridge that I looked back over my shoulder and saw the flickering light again. But now it was closer. I couldn't explain it. The light was far too far down in the valley for someone to have traveled that fast, and there was no trail in that area. It didn't make sense. That night, I camped near the top of a peak. My nerves were on edge, but I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation, the quiet stretching out over the landscape, messing with my mind. I stayed awake longer than usual, watching the horizon, but eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up again, the same strange feeling creeping over me. This time, though, I was sure I heard footsteps near my tent. This wasn't just a rustling in the leaves or a passing animal. These were the unmistakable sounds of someone walking, moving cautiously, trying to be quiet. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, rifle, and set out to confront whoever or whatever was out there. I unzipped my tent and stepped into the cold night air, my heart racing. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I slowly turned, scanning the area around me. That's when I noticed something. In the distance, near where I had seen the light the night before, was the outline of a figure. It was standing still, just outside the range of my flashlight. My first instinct was to call out, but my throat felt tight, frozen. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, even from that distance. I held my rifle tight, prepared to defend myself. But before I could react, the figure disappeared into the trees. I didn't stick around. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before and started moving, heading in the opposite direction. I didn't stop until I found a trail junction, and there I finally encountered another hiker. The relief I felt was palpable, but I didn't tell him what had happened. It didn't matter. I was done. When I made it back to the trailhead a day later, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. As I sat in my car, I glanced over my shoulder at the mountain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I never returned to that section of the Appalachian Trail. I couldn't, and to this day I wonder if I had just imagined it all. Maybe I was just seeing things, or maybe the forest had a way of playing with your mind when you were isolated long enough. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't human. And I'll never forget that forgotten camp, the place I stumbled upon but never fully understood. I had always been a fan of the great outdoors, something about the solitude, the freedom of hiking through vast stretches of wilderness, and the sense of adventure that came with each new trail. Over the years, I'd spent countless nights under the stars, and many of them were solo trips. This particular trip, though, would be one I would never forget. It started innocently enough. I'd planned a 5-day trek through a remote section of the Idaho wilderness, a spot not many people ventured to. The idea was simple: hike the trail, set up camp at night, and enjoy the solitude. I packed light, making sure to bring only the essentials: a tent, a small camp stove, sleeping bag, food, and a rifle for protection. I didn't anticipate any trouble. I was experienced, and this trail was known to be quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. The first few days went by without incident. The weather was crisp, the air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I felt like I was in my element, lost in nature's embrace. At night, I camped far off the trail, just in case any other hikers passed by. I wasn't one for company on these trips. It was just me and the wilderness. On the third night, things began to take a turn. I had set up camp near a small creek, a perfect spot for a quiet night of solitude. After eating a simple dinner and watching the sun set behind the trees, I retired to my tent to read and unwind. It wasn't long before I began hearing strange sounds outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps some nocturnal animal moving about. But then I heard something distinct. Footsteps, heavy footsteps. Not the quiet scurrying of a deer or the light pattering of a raccoon, but deliberate, slow steps. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving closer to my camp. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, listening intently. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't bring myself to go out and investigate. The idea of encountering another hiker in such a remote area seemed unlikely, and the thought of being out there alone with whatever this was filled me with dread. I reached for my rifle, which was resting beside me in my tent. My grip tightened on it as I listened for any further movement. Minutes passed, but nothing more happened. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks on me or an animal passing through. But my gut told me otherwise. I wasn't going to sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up quickly and continued down the trail. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me. But when I turned around, there was no one. The forest was silent. I made camp that night near an old abandoned cabin that I had passed earlier in the day. The structure was weathered and broken down, but it provided some shelter, and I thought it might be a good place to spend the night. I wasn't a superstitious person, but something about the cabin gave me a strange sense of unease. As night fell, I settled in by the fire, cooking my meal and trying to shake off the unsettling feeling from the previous night. I kept the fire going, hoping the warmth would keep whatever was out there at bay. But as the darkness grew deeper, so did the sense of dread. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time they were closer. They were unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking around the cabin. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my rifle and slipped out of the cabin, trying to move quietly. The woods were eerily silent, save for the crunch of leaves underfoot as the steps grew closer. I crept around the back of the cabin, staying hidden in the shadows. And then I saw it. A figure. A man standing at the edge of the trees, just outside the firelight's reach. He was tall, gaunt, and eerily still. I couldn't make out his face, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching the cabin. My mind raced. Was he a hiker, a hunter, or something else? I wasn't sure, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. My pulse raced as I raised my rifle, hoping to catch his attention. But before I could make a sound, the figure suddenly disappeared into the woods. No footsteps, no rustling, just gone. I didn't waste any time. I ran back into the cabin, bolting the door behind me. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, my rifle in my lap, my eyes fixed on the door. I don't know how I managed to sleep, but eventually exhaustion won out. The next morning I woke up early, determined to leave. As I packed my things, I noticed something strange. The ground around the cabin was soft from recent rain, and there were no tracks, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. It was as if the figure I had seen had never been there at all. My mind began to race, trying to piece together what had happened. Was I hallucinating? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was something else at play? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to find out. I left the cabin as fast as I could, continuing down the trail at a pace I had never kept before. I didn't stop to eat or rest. I just kept moving, praying I would make it out of the woods alive. As I approached the trailhead, I finally allowed myself to slow down. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. The wilderness had done something to me. It had twisted my perception, turned my own senses against me. But when I reached my car, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was free. Weeks later, I looked back on the experience. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew something had been out there with me. The footsteps, the figure, the overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just my imagination. Something or someone had been stalking me in those woods. I didn't go back into the wilderness for a long time after that. The memories still haunt me. I tell myself I was just unlucky, that I'd stumbled into a place best left undisturbed. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel as though something is still watching me from the shadows. I had always loved the idea of getting away from it all, of disappearing into the wilderness and escaping the noise of the world. My idea of a vacation was always the same, a solo backpacking trip in some remote corner of the country where the only sound you could hear was the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. This time, I decided to hike deep into the Colorado Rockies in an area known for its isolation. The trailhead was far from civilization, and the closest town was miles away. It was the perfect place to get some peace, to clear my head after a long, stressful few months. I planned a week-long solo journey, starting with a 15-mile hike into the backcountry where I'd camp by a small, secluded lake. The first few days went as expected. Beautiful views, crisp air, the satisfaction of having nothing to worry about except the next stretch of trail. The woods were thick and dark, the trees towering above, casting long shadows that seemed to move with the wind. The sound of birds, distant streams, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot was soothing, almost hypnotic. But on the third day, I began to notice something strange. It wasn't obvious at first. It started with a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, something that I thought might just be the forest playing tricks on me. I'd catch glimpses of something, maybe a shadow or a figure, just outside the range of my sight, and when I turned to look, nothing would be there. But the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I chalked it up to the isolation and exhaustion. After all, I was miles from the nearest person, and it was easy to start imagining things when you were alone in the woods for days on end. That night, I camped by a creek, the sound of water rushing over the rocks acting as a calming lullaby. I set up my tent and settled in for the night, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the rustling of the trees outside. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, muffled but distinct, crunching through the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding. I was alone. There was no one out here, at least not for miles. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. There was no sound of breathing, no movement, just the weight of silence hanging in the air. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle just in case, but my hands were shaking too much to do anything quickly. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. No more footsteps, no strange sounds, just the quiet of the night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. But that nagging feeling of being watched lingered. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. But as I was breaking down camp, I noticed something odd. The ground around my tent was disturbed, as though someone, or something, had been walking around it. The tracks were clear, but they weren't human. They were too large, too wide, and far too deep to have been made by any animal I knew of. I tried to brush it off, but my unease deepened. I pushed on, hiking farther into the wilderness, determined to put the strange encounter behind me. The landscape grew more rugged, the trees denser. As I entered a section of the forest where the pine trees were thick and twisted, the air grew heavier, colder. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find a place to camp for the night. I found a small clearing near an old, gnarled oak tree, its roots twisted like fingers clutching the earth. That night, as I sat by my fire, the woods felt different. The silence was deeper, more profound, and the wind whispered through the trees in a way that made my skin crawl. I was certain I wasn't alone anymore. As the night wore on, I kept hearing whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs just beyond my reach. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking. I thought I could hear my name in the wind, faint but distinct. Matt. Matt. I stood up, looking around in a panic, but I saw nothing. No one. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, shining the beam into the trees. For a moment, everything was still. But then, in the distance, I saw something moving. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. The figure was watching me, its face hidden in shadow, its posture unnaturally rigid. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. as my mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The whispers grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, a maddening jumble of words that made no sense. Leave. Leave now. Or stay forever. The words echoed in my head, but they weren't coming from the figure. No, the voices were coming from the very trees themselves. In a panic, I grabbed my gear and ran, not knowing which direction I was heading. I didn't care. I just had to get away from that clearing, from the whispers, from the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. The darkness swallowed me whole as I stumbled through the forest. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being hunted never left. It wasn't until dawn that I found a small cabin, abandoned and weathered, hidden deep in the woods. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, but I had no choice. I broke in and barricaded the door, exhausted and trembling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing those whispers, even inside the cabin. The sound of the wind through the trees seemed to carry voices, distant but clear, as if something was trying to reach me. Matt, we've been waiting for you. The whispers were almost soothing now, as if they had accepted me, as if they wanted me to stay forever. I spent the next few days in that cabin, too afraid to leave, too terrified to face the forest again. The longer I stayed, the more I realized that something had changed inside me. I could feel it, a shift in my mind, as though I were becoming part of the woods, part of something ancient, something that had always been there, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. Eventually, I made my way back to the trailhead, shaken and broken. I never spoke about what happened to anyone, but I know deep in my heart that something in those woods never let me go. It's always with me, those whispers in the back of my mind, calling me back to the wilderness where I belong. I don't know if I'll ever go back to those woods again, but I know that they're always there, waiting, and I can still hear the whispers, soft as the wind, calling me to return.